My aim today is to zoom out a little bit from the day-to-day work we do in basic science and look at the structure around the science that we do. And in particular, two directions that my research is moving in partnership with a number of different teams around the world, is open science and citizen science. And of course, everybody in this room knows what these terms mean. I'm actually quite new to them, to be honest. I don't think of myself as any kind of well-versed expert in either of these concepts. I'm much more of a doer than a thinker. So everything that we've learned and everything I'm going to talk about today has been developed through the crucible of experience and doing things wrong and finding out what happens. So it's going to be a bit of an interesting journey as we go. And I guess the overriding context for all of this is that science is really changing in a way that we haven't seen in a long time. There's particularly in the behavioural sciences and in psychology, where a lot of this change, that's kind of the ground zero for a lot of this reform and a lot of this transformation, but spreading to other areas. So I'm going to give you a few examples of how I think it's changing. Up to now, if you look at a lot of research in psychology, in the life sciences and in the social sciences more generally, we see a dominance of closed practices where research happens behind closed doors within silos, data isn't shared, methodological detail in published work is sparse, and publications act more as brochures or advertisements for the work that people are doing rather than recipes that can be repeated or offering deeper insights. That's changing now gradually toward a culture of more standardized open science in which archiving of data, analytic code and materials is becoming more normal, and that's all happening in parallel with the open access movement in which the product of our research, our peer-reviewed publications, are made available to the taxpayers who ultimately pay for the research in the first place. Up to now, small research samples, lab-based studies in humans have really dominated the scene. I use this term pejoratively, deliberately, petty fiefdoms. I have one of my own. I have a petty fiefdom. I have my own lab, my little group, my little team. I'm one of many little teams scattered around the country in different universities that work in neuroscience or psychology. And you can find these in most areas of science and research. The problems we face in working in these small groups, in these little kind of mini empires, is that we can very rarely make large steps forward. We compete intensively for funding. We are pressured to sell our results in ways which distort the truth. That's now shifting perhaps toward, and something I'll talk about today more, internet-based testing, working in consortia, tackling big questions in a way that we see in physics, for example. If you look at high-energy physics, we see CERN, fantastic example of scientists coming together to answer important questions without worrying too much about ego and personal achievement, but focusing more on what's good for the collective. Up to now, when we look at the published record, particularly in my area, but looking across a number of different sciences, we see an emphasis on novelty and originality of results. It's not about the rigor of the method so much, or the question you're asking, it's about whether your results tell something exciting. Are they novel? Are they something we didn't know before? Is it boring? These kinds of subjective aspects of storytelling have dominated the publication process, and admittedly they still do, but we're seeing that shifting now toward an emphasis on transparency of research practices and reproducibility. Core fundamental features of the scientific method, which are assumed to be kind of ubiquitous, but have actually been ignored and degraded over many years. And one of these is study pre-registration, one of these practices to try and enhance the openness and transparency of the research process and minimize bias. Up to now, the Haldane Principle has dominated a lot of the decisions that are made about which science gets funded and which science gets done. So obviously the principle that scientists themselves decide which science gets done. That's shifting increasingly as we see non-scientists, and in particular politicians and other groups, deciding the agenda for research and influencing, for example, the strategic priorities of research councils. And given Paul Nurse's review into the restructuring of the research councils and the greater ministerial involvement we're likely to see in setting those priorities, it looks like that's going to increase even more. And up to now, the deficit model of science communication, in which science is seen as something to fill a gap in the public's understanding, give them the facts and they'll be more rational, has really been the way in which a lot of communication has been pursued by scientists and by the media. That's changing. We're seeing a much more interactive dialogue with the public in the reporting of science, facilitated largely by the emergence of blogs, comments below the line. This is a Wild West kind of jungle world we're entering, but it's one that's ultimately much more interactive. So this is what's changing. And I think it's legitimate to ask why this is happening now. This is a face many of us know, Diederik Stapel, the most prolific fraudster known in psychological research in the Netherlands. He was exposed some years ago now. This acted as a catalyst for driving a number of reforms in psychology and beyond. Clear evidence that short of the blackest of frauds, there's a wide grey area of questionable research practices which researchers in most life and social sciences routinely exploit in order to generate publishable narratives from their studies. We see this evidence of such biased practices in clinical and basic science. The term p-hacking is probably familiar to you, where analyses are selectively reported that are statistically significant or positive. And we see it in medicine in what Ben Goldacre and his team have referred to as hidden outcome switching, where trials are registered with one set of outcome measures, change those outcome measures covertly after the study is complete so that they can tell a more publishable story from the results. Another reason this is happening now is the inability we're finding to replicate high-profile results across a wide range of areas, from basic science through to drug discovery, cancer research, and so on. We're seeing a lot of challenges in reproducing effects that we all believed were true when we apply the test of less biased, more powerful methods to them, and they fail. On a more positive note, we're seeing emerging technology to create more tools for scientists to engage in open practices. One great example is the Open Science Framework based in Virginia, which has created a whole range of tools that scientists can use to painlessly integrate transparent practices into their research process, whether that's pre-registration of protocols, data sharing, sharing of materials in code, or disclosure of details in studies. And in parallel with that, technology is helping us take our research out of the laboratory, and in particular in psychology, where there's a dominance of small samples in usually psychology undergraduate students. This has been the status quo for many years. It leads to great problems in drawing inferences, low statistical power, threatens the integrity of the entire research base. But technology is allowing us to now think about doing such experiments outside the lab, in the real world, using smartphones and other forms of media, which can enable us to access very large samples and more representative samples than before. And that's opening up all kinds of challenges and opportunities, which I will talk about shortly. The rise of the open access movement is changing the scene, both in its interesting ways, legal ways that's been pursued for many years now, and the more subversive elements, as we've seen in the media lately. Sci-Hub has been very prominent. The website based in, which country is it based in? Kazakhstan, which has simply released millions of copyrighted PDFs that are owned by various publishers completely freely. And we're seeing that changing the scene as well and pushing reform in areas of transparency. Social media has changed the nature of the academic hierarchy, I think, and we see this week has been a really interesting week for psychology, in fact, because we've seen a prominent clique of very senior researchers at Harvard University come out and challenge whether there is a reproducibility problem in psychology. And in the old days, that may well have been the end of the discussion. But social media has reduced the discrepancy between how senior they are and how senior everybody else is, and allowed the debate to be much more even-handed, and has exposed problems and flaws in their argument. And it's really interesting watching this unfold. You see that the lowliest graduate student can have the same voice on social media as the most prestigious professor. And in fact, sometimes the graduate student will have a much larger audience because they're much more engaged in social media than the professor will be. So this is really challenging the nature of these hierarchies which have dominated for so long. And it's allowing these political movements to form, which we have to be honest, are political movements. The open science movement is not just an evidence-based approach to doing science. It is a political revolution or evolution in the way we think about doing our research. It's moral in many ways, and social media has provided the infrastructure to allow this to happen. And finally, we're seeing the emergence of alternative models of science communication. As I mentioned, blogging, the Guardian Science Blog Network, which I'm happy to contribute to, and other blogs. The world is full of fantastic science blogs out there, written by a range of known and unknown people. That's something which is challenging the traditional, conventional approach of scientist publishes paper in journal, university issues press release, journalist interviews scientist, writes bad article. That is changing, because now the great thing about the Science Blog Network is that the scientists themselves are writing most of the stories, right? Straight from the coalface. Scientists writing about science in an accessible way and engaging in a dialogue with the public in a way that hasn't happened before. So that's all of these things, I think, explain why we're seeing all the changes in science that we're seeing right now. And that's the backdrop against which I'm going to talk about some of the possibilities that we've been exploring in our research and some of the challenges and realities. So just to summarize, open science, citizen science, and I guess bigger science. I don't really like the word big data, so I'm going to use bigger science instead. But the possibilities that this opens up, I think, are really amazing. It's this great time to be doing science, because all of a sudden we have all of these initiatives and tools available to us which could take us in any number of different directions. And finally, having a knowledge base of studies where materials are reusable, that I can repeat an experiment that someone else has done, even if it's in a very complex area, like say in a social science or in a psychological setting, and actually repeat that experiment. That's something that's been very difficult to do, but is increasingly becoming more possible. The increasing emphasis on pre-registration of study methods and analysis plans so that we can improve the baseline reproducibility of the knowledge base itself, distinguishing the testing of hypotheses from the generation of hypotheses, from, if you like, confirmation versus exploration. Very important approaches to distinguish in science. We don't want to ever confuse deduction with induction, and yet we do so routinely. And pre-registration is one of the tools we have to help avoid fooling ourselves, which is very easy to do. Open peer review, which is another kind of side effect of all of this, that we're seeing a rising movement toward the review process itself being more transparent to improve the quality and fairness and open access. Citizen science, I think, is playing a very big role increasingly. Seeing the public not just as a resource to be farmed as participants or respondents to surveys, but actually as active researchers or analysts in the process. And I'm going to talk about one example of where we have done this. And also using that public to source ideas, I think, is a really interesting idea. That the fact comes back to the Haldane Principle, if you like. There is a definite role for scientists to play in deciding what science gets done. That's crucial. Expertise is vital. But there is also a role, I think, for the public to feed into that discussion and say, you know what, we would really like some research done in this particular area. And as I mentioned, bigger science, getting out of the lab, using smartphones, asking ourselves, at least within my area, do I really need to be doing this research in a lab? Am I only doing it in a lab because that's how it's always been done? Or is there a specific technical reason why this needs to be lab-based? If there isn't, it should be done out there, because you benefit so much more. In one of the projects I'll talk about, we combined or attempted to combine these two aspects, and in the second one, which is in the planning phase, we're trying to set up a citizen science portal, a provisional name for this thing we're creating, where we're trying to combine all three of these. And along the way, there's a number of challenges that we face in doing this. Ethics is a big one. When you're doing work out there in the real world with the public as a researcher, where there's confidentiality issues, there's the safety of the researchers, the citizen scientists, if you like, who are doing the work for you, particularly if they're going places and doing things. There's the career risks faced by particularly early career scientists in being transparent and open, when doing so risks dealing you out of the game that your more ambitious colleagues are playing in order to climb the greasy pole. And there's the issue of, I think, balancing the democratization of science, so getting the public involved in the decisions about what science gets done, versus surrendering to populism and doing research only because some people, there's a large community of people that want it done. And populism, as we see, for example, in the US at the moment, is a real threat to rational decision making. And so there needs to be some balance there achieved between involving the public and also preserving some rational oversight of that process. Now, I am not by any stretch the first to delve into this area, and there are many people who have achieved much more than we have already. For example, Tom Stafford, now I think a couple of years ago, published a really excellent paper in a major psychology journal reporting how people learn using an online game in over 850,000 participants. Huge sample. I think it may be the largest sample ever included in a psychology study. And it's a fantastic example of using internet-based resources to really increase on orders of magnitude the level of insight you can have into psychological theory. And as of course many of you here will be familiar with Zooniverse, which is leading the way in citizen science and creating all kinds of fascinating venues and projects that the members of the public can participate in here. So I am not going to talk about either of these projects in detail. I'm going to talk about what we've done, but I do want to add the caveat that what I'm doing is nowhere near on the scale of this. What we're doing is dabbling in specific questions that have come up and overcoming challenges. And one of those has been a project where the aim is fundamentally to gather evidence about the use of evidence, and in particular evidence-based policy. And it stems from a book that was published a few years ago now by Mark Henderson, who's now the head of communications at the Wellcome Trust, called the Geek Manifesto, in which he argued that we need to see a much greater active involvement of scientists in policy making in order to push back against the rising tide of what he refers to as policy-based evidence, the cherry-picking of data selectively in order to support predetermined policy decisions. This is obviously very important, but it needs an active drive from the scientific community. We need to create links between scientists and the political community for this to actually work. And so he calls for greater engagement. And in response, we've tried to develop a potential solution to this. This is a very rough summary of how it works at the moment, when the sciences are over here and the academic system is over here and on this side, and politicians and civil servants and support staff are in another completely different sphere. And there's a very small community of scientists who traverse that divide and speak regularly and involved in policy making, because we speak different languages in many cases. Policymakers and scientists and academics don't naturally get along very easily. But most of us exist in this kind of big blue zone here, where we don't really have a lot of active interaction with politics. And that is to the detriment of society, we think. And that's the thesis of Mark's book. So we proposed as an idea what we're calling the Evidence Information Service, which is essentially a matchmaking resource, which has a simple purpose, which is to provide a connection point between a politician or a civil servant or a member of parliament. If they have a question that requires the use of evidence, they can connect very quickly to a set of academics or an expert in a particular field and get rapid response and get some kind of rapid dialogue going. The idea is that it would be open to all elected representatives and civil servants. Questions would be raised either online or via a phone interface. The role of the EIS is to provide that matchmaking service, that waypoint, that hub, which connects these two worlds. And the idea would be that it's fast, free, confidential, potentially. We thought it could be useful. We initially based it on the Science Media Centre's model, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. The Science Media Centre performs a similar role connecting journalists and scientists when there's a breaking news story that's particularly controversial. They essentially act as that intermediary, providing quotes and connection points between journalists and academics. We thought, why couldn't we just take this concept and apply it in the political sphere instead? So beginning some years ago now, we began by consulting all kinds of different individuals and organisations connected to or within Parliament. And we wanted to know, really, did this already exist? Are we just reinventing the wheel? Is it the case that there are all these different mechanisms already within Parliament for promoting science and evidence? Are we just reinventing what they already do? Could they just be done better? The answer we seemed to get back was from the majority of people we talked to was, no, this doesn't really exist, this would be useful. But even then, we still didn't know what really it would need to look like. We had this idea in our minds that the EIS would want to be this rapid matchmaking service, but we had no evidence upon which to base that would MPs use such a service if it existed? We needed to do some kind of consultation in parliamentarians in order to get that answer. Namely, what kind of experience did the parliamentarians already have with handling evidence? What kind of challenges have they faced in dealing with data, in accessing evidence, in interpreting evidence in the past? If an EIS did exist, what sort of features would it need to have for it to be useful to them, be something that they would go to on a regular basis in order to make the most of? So what kind of time frame, what kind of level of confidentiality? How would they like the information delivered to them to be most useful? How many experts would they want to talk to? We needed answers to these specific questions. And what would it take for them to actually trust the information that they get so that it could be incorporated into parliamentary debates, policies, and so on? And would they use it? If it met all these conditions, would they use it? And if the answer was yes, great, we can proceed. If the answer is no, well, we can stop right there. Now, usually, this is how you would do research like this. You would maybe email a survey to parliamentarians and get some kind of answers from them. It would have to be very short. It would have to be something that really was very quick and easy to do. But we decided early on this would not be a promising strategy because a similar, slightly different, but similar, at least in a general sense, survey had been attempted on members of Parliament in the UK some years ago by an organisation within Westminster itself. Okay, this is an organisation that MPs know and respect, and they got 12 responses out of over 600 members of Parliament. 12. I mean, this is for a 5-minute survey. That's a failure. So we knew that wasn't going to be promising. If they only got 12 and they're all within Westminster, how many are we going to get? I mean, we had to be realistic. Another approach would be to apply for a research grant and then employ a whole lot of researchers to go around the country and visit and interview parliamentarians one by one. This wasn't feasible either because I'm a psychologist and a neuroscientist, and the other people on the team are physicists or other neuroscientists and so on. We had no track record in policy research, complete newbies. There's no way we were going to get a research grant of the magnitude you would need to do that kind of project. And on top of that, even if we did have the money, the MPs again have no reason to engage with the researchers because they're not constituents. And let's suppose we did get the funding and we could somehow solve those problems. Traditionally, when we looked at research that had been done in this area before, within this kind of area of social science, we found that it's very hard to get hold of actual data that's been collected previously. People tend to publish interview extracts, sample quotes, grounded theory or qualitative analyses without the meaning unit specified, without the various components in place that would enable you to reproduce what's been done before. In essence, closed practices. So you could say, well, the conventional way of doing this research, if you're in our position, would be not to do it at all and say, let's just leave that to the policy researchers, give up, get back to your job. And really don't assume you can just step into an area you know nothing about. There's an arrogance to that. Now, fortunately, a lack of arrogance isn't a problem we seem to have, as we've been told. So what we did instead was we decided to turn this whole thing around and put our project in the public domain and see what happens. So we wrote a couple of articles on the Guardian Science Network back in March 2014 where we explained the project and we called for members of the public to go and interview their own MPs as citizen researchers to try and get the information we needed themselves. We had no idea whether this would succeed or fail. Would anyone care enough out there to actually go, to take the effort to book an appointment with their Member of Parliament and go and see them and ask questions? We called these people local champions, and we chose this as a potential model because, first of all, it's cost effective for us. We didn't have a research grant to do any of this. This is all being done essentially on the smell of an oily rag. We hoped it would engage interested members of the public, as citizen science should, to try and bring people into the research process from the beginning. And the big practical factor here is that constituents have a much easier time getting access to their members of Parliament than people beyond that constituency. It's very difficult, in fact, for members of Parliament to say no to requested meetings with their constituents. They have a professional obligation that's laid out in parliamentary regulations to say that they should make all attempts to meet with constituents. So we felt that this provided an access point that we weren't able to exploit ourselves, whilst also engaging the public in a way that was more efficient. And then, on top of that, because we really wanted to create a resource that could be reused, we decided to try and turn this into an open science project as well. So obtaining consent from the parliamentarians themselves to publish the interview transcripts, because these interviews would be recorded, and then post these online when we publish the work. So that, because there's a huge amount of data here which we were not going to be able to analyse, which social scientists could look at. We were only interested in very specific questions, but interviews can go all over the place. They can roam freely. There's all kinds of interesting, rich, qualitative data one could extract. And also it enables independent researchers to go in, check our results, make sure we haven't made any mistakes, and most importantly, it prevents data loss. If this data isn't archived from projects like this, it will be lost. We know this from many studies in psychology which have attempted to access data that hasn't been archived, and there's a huge failure rate. Researchers change computers, they change jobs, they can't understand their own data anymore, they don't want to send it on, and it's lost forever, and it's lost to science, it's lost to the future. But it's not so easy. So it was a really interesting process getting permission to do this work. And the biggest barrier we faced was ethics. So I'll take you through just a few of the challenges we faced convincing our own ethics committee to approve this work. First of all, it took 6 resubmissions for me to get approval for this, even though I felt that it was a fairly innocuous project. The ethics committee objected using citizen researchers, as they felt that could be potentially coercive for the MPs, that the MPs couldn't really say no to interviewing their own constituents. Their constituents were effectively their employers. And we were putting the constituents in a position where they could potentially damage the participant, which is the MP. This exposed a conflict between, on the one hand, the democratic responsibility, the professional responsibility of that MP to meet with their constituent to discuss an issue that the constituent cares about, versus the BPS guidelines on what ethical consent consists of. And it's really interesting. There's no easy answer to this, but there's an argument on both sides. I don't think the ethics committee was wrong to challenge us on this, but we felt that they were seeing the work as more interventional than it really was. We argued that this was observational research. There's nothing to stop anyone in this room making an appointment with their member of parliament, sitting down with them for 20 minutes and talking about evidence-based policy, if that's what they wanted to do. And we felt that all we were doing was giving people a nudge to go and do this, and then using the results for our research. So we felt like it was basically like just observing what could happen anyway within a natural context. But eventually, after many resubmissions, we were forced to give MPs the option to decline the interview with their constituent because it was for research purposes. We were forced to give the members of parliament a way out of talking to their constituent simply because we were going to use this information in a research project. I felt this was counterproductive because it would lead to a more self-selected sample of members of parliament. Those who already care about the issue would be more likely to say yes to seeing their constituent, whereas those provided with an excuse, well, I don't have to do this, I don't care about this issue, they're going to say no. So it biases your sample in the end. On top of that, we were required to develop this quite complicated system where members of the public could see whether their local member of parliament had been assigned a local champion or not, but they couldn't see whether or not that member of parliament had agreed to an interview or not. So we had to also protect the confidentiality of the MPs in terms of whether they agreed or declined the interview. So it's quite a complicated process of ethical assessment. Now, I'm not passing judgment on our ethics committee. It's a difficult conundrum they were faced with. On the one hand, they admitted to me, this is basically observational work, but on the other hand, it's not. And so where do you draw the line here? On top of that, we have to do risk assessment. And, what happens if, and this is a real issue for citizen science, what if you recruit somebody in the community to go and do something in the real world? They're not sitting at a computer counting galaxies, they're actually going out there and doing something, and they get injured or killed, or something bad happens. Are you responsible? And ultimately the answer to that was, it was a question of baseline risk. Are they engaged in additional risk over and above what they would be doing on a daily basis anyway? And we passed the risk assessment only because it was seen that a member of the public, catching the bus or driving or walking to go and see their member of parliament was not seen to be inherently risky over and above going and buying a loaf of bread, say. So that was okay. This is the local champions and constituencies that we ended up with in the project. Reasonable national spread, although you can see none in Northern Ireland and few in Scotland. This is the consort style chart of how it all played out. So we started off with 130 of these local champions who signed up to take part in the project. Some we never heard from again. Some, 86, then contacted their parliamentarian, of which 56 obtained agreement from the MP or parliamentarian to conduct the interview. Look at here. 29 parliamentarians either declined, cancelled, or refused to respond to the inquiry. I don't think that would have happened had we not been forced by our ethics committee to allow the members of parliament to say no. So that's the price you pay for balancing the ethics against the practicalities of doing good research in this area. So we ended up with 56 interviews, which may not sound like many when you're dealing with hundreds and hundreds of members of parliament, but it's still the largest ever, believe it or not, and this is a bit shameful really, but it's still the largest ever consultation in the UK on what parliamentarians think about evidence-based policy, how they use evidence, and whether a resource like this would be useful. What did we learn from doing this? Pretty much what we expected, to be honest. We weren't far off in our guess as to what would be useful. The parliamentarians wanted a fast service, ideally 24-hour turnaround, talking to academics, getting them on the phone, asking them questions. They wanted a service that would be confidential sometimes, if they wanted confidentiality, if they felt they were asking a stupid question, or didn't want their political opponents to know that they were even asking a question. But they only wanted confidentiality for them. They wanted to know exactly who they were talking to all the time. That was crucial. They needed to know whether the source was legitimate, etc. They preferred visual summaries or executive summaries. The number of experts ranged widely from one to crowdsourcing a whole group. They preferred phone primarily as the interface, but with an online option. They emphasised the importance for neutrality of such a system, that it would need to be governed very strictly by a code of practice, as many such mechanisms already are. And they also, one point that we didn't anticipate, which is quite interesting, is that they advised us to integrate this service within the House of Commons Library, which some of you may know provides a research service for Parliament, where any member of Parliament can ask really any question at all. The House of Commons Library will find them an answer. And the House of Commons Library are very enthusiastic about our service because it's something that they can use to help their job. So integrating it within the library achieves a number of different aims. In particular, it increases the trust that the members of Parliament would have in the service because it's part of what they already use. Most, happily to say, parliamentarians said they would use such a service if it existed. And that really wasn't changed by the outcome, by the way, of the election. We did it because a lot of MPs got booted out, so we did an analysis after the election to see if it changed those who were left, and it didn't. The open citizen science angle here is that we decided to share everything. So all anonymised interview transcripts we dumped on Figshare with guidance notes. It wasn't just a data dump. We provided materials that people could use to help interpret them. There's over 125,000 words of transcripts from this study, which we have only scratched the surface of in answering the questions that we wanted to answer. So there's a PhD in there for somebody, from a social scientist who wants to go in and delve into the dynamics of these interviews and learn more from them. This is an example of some of the material that we've archived. This is an example of the guidance notes that accompany the data. Here's an example of one of the anonymised interviews with various details carefully redacted by the team to prevent easy identification of particular members of Parliament. What next with this project? Well, the citizen science approach really opened the door for us. There was no way we could have done this research if we hadn't recruited members of the public to really collect the data for us. It just never would have happened. We didn't have the funding, we didn't have the access, we didn't have the ability to do it. In the wake of just before the last general election, we published some preliminary results from the consultation, and since then we've had our first peer-reviewed article on this in press and accepted. We're now working with the House of Commons Library because of this suggestion that was brought up through the consultation by many members of Parliament. Work with the library, work with the library. So we are now working with the library, and it's great because they're happy to be involved as well. So it's provided an additional entry point. And now that because we have the track record of the peer-reviewed research, we can apply for the funding that we need to take this to the next level, to pilot this service properly and to test the mechanism through the library. So that's an example of how we've tried to combine open science and citizen science in a way to answer a very specific question that we really couldn't, there's no other way we could have done this research. It wasn't a case of us going, we want to do citizen science. It was, I'm a big fan of citizen science, but it was used for a very specific reason. That there's simply no other way we could have conducted such a project. Next, I'll talk about a way that we're planning to bring these three things together. Also the behavioural research and the bigger question of collecting data outside the lab in the real world. And so I'm going to change direction a little bit here and focus on the problem of obesity. So this is a World Health Organization global map of individuals with BMIs in the over obese range. In 1991, here it is in 2001, and look at what happens in 2010. So the problem is getting worse, and a large part of my basic day-to-day research is investigating the basic mechanisms for why this might happen, in particular self-control. And one of the discoveries that's emerging is that we're very dependent on cues in our environment, and cognitive control, self-control, this thing that you believe is a very deliberate, conscious act, is in fact very automatic in many cases, and indeed could be described as a reflex, a cognitive control reflex. And we're very much slaves to this reflex. How we react to stimuli like these food cues when in a shop or on TV adverts differs greatly from one person to the next. So we thought, could this be exploited in a laboratory context to provide evidence that training people to overcome these reflexes could benefit their self-control? For example, one simple small study that we did where we trained people to inhibit simple actions in a computer task to images of crisps. Okay, this is really, it was a ridiculous kind of thing to try and do, but just train people to start and stop responses to images of crisps, and then you find out how many they eat afterwards. And you can do various forms of these kinds of experiments. They eat less. Great, but huge problems in this area, and these problems problems that we face in our own research. All of the studies are small. We're dealing with undergraduate student samples. You probably kind of know what you're doing. They're kind of guessing the aims anyway. And there's a lot of bias in the research practices. There's a lot of selective publishing of results that look good or tell a good story. There's a lot of publication bias by journals which really prefer positive, statistically significant findings. The samples, because they're so small, we don't understand the role of individual differences. Individual differences are a huge factor in determining self-control, and yet research on this scale, it's pointless looking at it. The samples are way, way too small. We don't really know, even if this kind of training works in a laboratory context, does it translate to the way people behave in the real world? Would they eat less junk food? Would they make better eating decisions when they're shopping, for example? And we don't know which methods work best, so which training methods. You know, there's all kinds of different tasks you can give people, from stop tasks to games where they have to avoid stimuli, to building up negative associations, a little bit like Clockwork Orange. There's all kinds of different methods that you can try. So the aim of this project, which I submitted to the European Research Council, was to try and get a grip on the answer using mass internet-based testing. So I took 7 of the training methods that are suggested to be most effective. And the aim is to test them on a very large sample on real-life measures of body weight and cognition over a 3-month period. Different kinds of training in a very large sample globally. This is just a very brief example of one type of game where on a smartphone people would be trained to, in a gamified context, to catch incoming targets of healthy foods and simply avoid unhealthy foods and basically ignore things you can't eat like bookshelves and that kind of thing. Obviously it wouldn't look like this. We're going to get a professional programmer to do this and it'll look great. But this is my really crappy kind of cartoon version. But the idea is this is just one example of the kind of game which you might think this is really silly. How could this ever work? But if you were to look at the psychological research literature, you would say, well, the evidence suggests that it might. This might work. We just don't know. That's the thing. We just don't know. So we need to find out. The innovations which I went to the ERC with was that because this was internet-based, it was the largest basically study that had been tried in this area before. Big sample means lots of statistical power. The aim was to have 1,000 subjects in every experiment and to do that experiment twice. so that you can always replicate what you found the first time, because chance operates in any sample. You can always find something by chance, much less chance of finding something by chance if you replicate. Because of the sample size, we can look at individual differences. We're going to pre-register all other protocols before we start, okay, to make things more transparent, to stop fooling ourselves, because that's the Richard Feynman's famous quote, you know, we're the easiest person to fool is ourselves. And when we're doing this kind of research, it's very easy to see what we want to see. And the bit that's perhaps most interesting to you guys is the resource we're trying to create here. Originally, it was just going to be Guardian experiments, a new section of the Guardian we were going to create to do this one specific experiment, this massive internet trial. And we thought, that'd be kind of cool, you know. We had this connection already with the Guardian, so they were keen. It was going to be something that we're going to develop in-house, etc. But then we started thinking about it, and we thought, hang on a second, we could do something better. What if we were to create a separate, independent kind of resource, which we're provisionally calling Citizen Science Portal? There are members of my team who hate that name. They can't stand it. I don't really like it either. I can't think of anything better right now. Maybe you need to employ somebody. But I'm going to call it CSP for now. But the idea would be, what if you were to create this separate resource and then create your study within that, the self-control training trial that I just talked about, and then create a link. So the Guardian Experiments platform would still exist as a kind of front, right, which people would use as one access kind of port into this system where they could complete your study. If you did this, then all of a sudden you open up the possibility of other media outlets linking directly to your portal, your project, which is very important because we didn't just want this to be a Guardian project. There's very little chance somewhere like the Daily Mail would write an article linking to a Guardian resource. It just doesn't happen. The media are very competitive like that, but they might link to an independent site like this. And we have evidence that that can be beneficial. We ran a little kind of training version of this through a Daily Mail article in a very ad hoc way. We created one very basic online game, stuck a link into a Daily Mail article, and within 17 days we had 37,000 people do the experiment. I mean, that's a huge traffic that you just couldn't access in any other way. So it's important to open up this, I think, to more media outlets. But beyond this, we thought, why should this just be a one-shot? Couldn't you create a system where you can host all kinds of different studies on this portal? It didn't just be created for one study. It could be a resource that could be used in many different ways. So, and this is where the citizen science angle comes in. What if you crowdsource a certain number of projects through this portal? So you go to the public, you go to schools, you go to local communities, and you say, do you have a research project you want to conduct? It's important for your local area. It could be anything from just stuff that people are interested in to practical problems like dealing with a difficult traffic black spot or something. There's all kinds of polls, experiments that one could imagine running through such an online resource. Motivated and driven by an open science model in which a condition of entry, if you like, is adopting open practices of pre-registration and data sharing where ethically and legally permissible. And if we can create a resource here which is self-sustaining, there's even a possibility that it could start to act as a kind of funder for certain projects. So you can imagine developing countries or other disadvantaged groups coming to the CSP and saying, we have a really important project we want to run, we don't have access to funding, could we apply to use your service? And if they're funding it, if their application is successful, a developer who works on the project could help turn that idea into a reality. To try and turn this into a reality, we have to go a little bit beyond my current ERC funding, which supports the development of this first stage. It provides that capital investment that you need to generate this infrastructure. But we really need to make it sustainable for it to be useful in the longer term. And that's where additional funding schemes like the ERC proof of concept come in, which is a funding scheme that enables you to develop a spin-out or an additional idea from a basic ERC-funded research program. So our aim here is to try and launch the CSP toward the end of this year, including the self-control trial through my ERC project, but also a couple of other side projects as well that collaborators are interested in. But it's never that simple. So again, I came up against ethics. So when I when I put this through scientific review at the ERC, it went through relatively easily. They kind of liked the idea, it got pretty good reviews. But then after the funding was awarded, the ethics committee at the executive agency decided they had problems with it now. They were worried about possible recruitment of minors if you're doing internet-based testing. If you're doing an intervention on eating behaviour, is it a serious problem if children sign up and do it as well? Obviously, that's a risk in any kind of research. If we were doing that research in the lab, we would not recruit children. But when you're doing work online, you have to accept some degree of risk that you can never know who exactly is doing the experiment. In the same vein, the concern was raised about the possible recruitment of people with under-eating disorders, like anorexia, for example. And if you're developing a training program to help people eat less, is it risky for you to be recruiting people that are already a very low body mass index? They also had concerns about the way that participants we plan to reward participants. With very large samples, when you're doing internet-based testing, it's not possible to pay everyone in the way you would do if they were coming into the lab, where you reimburse them £6 an hour or whatever. It's just not possible. So we decided to apply a kind of random draw-based model where a small pot of money would be allocated to one in every X number of participants. Not a huge amount, maybe 20 or £50, but enough to provide some incentive for an overall kind of sample. But they didn't like that either because it was seen as coercive, because it was a random prize draw. On the other hand, we decided, okay, what if we shift it to charity donation? So instead of paying the participants directly, or even a fraction of them, we'll give a small amount to charity every time a participant does a training session. Ethics committee were happy with that, but now it violated ERC financial regulations. ERC is not allowed to donate money to charity. Who knew? Right, so these are the kinds of the lessons we've learned, and we're going to do all this. We have found ways around all of these issues. But the lesson we learned just practically is that citizen science and open science exist in one frame, and in the other frame we have this kind of old-fashioned research governance structures, which have 20th century models for how to do research, which are not designed to make it easy to do this kind of thing. They just throw up barrier upon barrier upon barrier. And so it's something that I think we need to be paying attention to if we're going to be raising the profile of this work. Some people would give up. We considered giving up at various points in these projects. You have to be persistent, but equally we need to be trying to drive change, I think, in those structures. So I would leave you with the thought that science is changing, but it's not changed yet. We're kind of in this zone here, in between the up to now and the future. And we've got to really work on that transition. We've got to try and make it as efficient and as easy as possible to navigate. Or what will happen is you'll get this natural kind of slingshot effect where scientists will dabble in this. They'll say, okay, I want to do open science, I want to do citizen science, and they'll try, oh, the ethics committee doesn't like it. I can't be bothered submitting 6 different submissions. Oh, the ERC doesn't like it because it violates some obscure law which nobody knew about. So we need to be thinking about ways of making that transition easy on a practical level. And I think it's really important to ask ourselves, how will we know when we've actually made it there? How will we know when the system is in place that facilitates all of these different mechanisms? And I was thinking about this last night, actually, and I think the answer is actually quite simple. It's when these terms disappear. It's when we no longer refer to open science as open science, or citizen science as citizen science, but they're simply part of science as a whole. There's no descriptor needed. These are simply natural ways, natural options within the scientific process. At that point, I think we'll know that we've made it. I'll finish just by acknowledging a number of collaborators. This is just scratching the surface, really, of the people I could fit on the slide, but my excellent investigators on the EIS, all of our EIS local champions who are fantastic, devoted people who performed these interviews completely voluntarily, and my collaborators on the CSP, our funders. And I'll just point out maybe a couple of related initiatives. I'll make these slides available afterwards, but if you're interested in some related initiatives that we're doing to promote openness and transparency, registered reports, the top guidelines, and the PRO initiative may be of interest. So thanks for your time.